Alright, this is Idiot with a library card. I left a little silence and came in quick to make you jump. Because the story I'm talking about today is a jumpy, scary story with twists and turns. Of course, I am talking about Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of Baskerville. And I gotta say, I really enjoyed this book. This is a novel. It's not a Sherlock short story. It's a novel. It's a Sherlock Holmes novel. And it's terrific. Now, if you're like me and you love book lists on the internet, and there's only 1 million of them, this one always makes the top as far as Sherlock Holmes stories. Even greatest stories of the 20th century, this usually sneaks up somewhere on there. It always makes it on mystery stories. It's always top 10. It's the best Sherlock Holmes story there is. And I wasn't sure if I was going to like it, because I find some of the short story lists, the lists of short stories which I've perused, where I'll say, this is the best story. And I've tended to stray a little bit from those, most drastically with A Scandal in Bohemia, which people seem to love, and I thought was boring. This one's really good. This one's a really good story, though. It's a good novel through and through. If I wasn't reading Sherlock Holmes novels, I would say this is a good novel to read anyway. If you're not even into Sherlock Holmes, but sort of into mystery, this one works on a few levels and is really well done. I'm not going to talk too much about the story itself, like a summary or anything like that. It's a complicated story with a lot of different characters, and I'll bring up some of the characters themselves, but for the most part, I just kind of want to talk about the tone of the story. And the story is interesting in that way, in that it's a tonal story. A lot of the story has to do with tone and atmosphere. The beginning of the story is very well done in that you start in London, you start at 221B Baker Street, and something's afoot in Baskerville. I'm sorry, something's afoot for Baskerville. Baskerville is the main character. I always thought the Hound of Baskerville was the location. It is not. There's a Baskerville estate. Some guy has died. Some kid has inherited it. The guy who died possibly because of a giant hound or dog or wolf. Not sure. It's very mysterious how he died, and it seems like there's some sort of paranormal thing going on, and whether that is the case or not, Sherlock is obviously skeptical. So is John Watson, who wouldn't be skeptical that a giant hellhound is running around the woods in, I think, northern London. I'm actually not completely clear as to where the place is, and we'll get to the atmosphere of the place itself. But what happens is the first 3 or 4 chapters are in London, and what it does is it sets the tone of there's a lot of different suspects, so you don't know who to trust. There's obviously some mischief afoot, so you know that it's not just that there's this dog running around. Like, it's not some Stephen King story where a crazy dog that no one has control over is in the woods eating people. Instead, you know it's a human crime, and there's a whole bunch of different suspects. So all the people you meet throughout the story, you end up being very skeptical. There's 3 people you're not skeptical about, which is basically Sherlock, John Watson, and Henry Baskerville, who is the guy they're trying to help, the guy they're trying to protect. So some creepy things happen in London. Henry Baskerville lives in Canada, and his great-uncle dies of fright. Like, he's so scared, apparently frightened by this giant dog, he has a heart attack or something and is dead. So he goes to London first, because if you're going to England, you're going to end up in London first, especially in that time in history. I assume all the boats basically went to London. You would have gone through London, which he does. And then he goes up to the Baskerville estate in Devonshire, which, if I was a better podcaster, I would have researched where Devonshire is. It doesn't matter. Some weird things happen to him while in London, Sherlock Holmes and John Watson realize that he's being followed, and the guy who's following him gets away. He's missing a boot for some reason. He puts his boots outside his hotel room to be cleaned. One comes back and one disappears, and there's some strange things afoot. But basically, Sherlock Holmes is working on another case, so he can't go up right away. Or so he says. So he sends John Watson up. And John Watson, who, if you haven't read any Sherlock Holmes, and this is the first one to start, which this one isn't a bad first one to start. You already have some cultural knowledge of Sherlock Holmes, I'm sure. But what might not be as obvious, just because you have more of a television knowledge or movie knowledge of Sherlock Holmes, is that John Watson writes all the stories, or all the stories are from his perspective, writing sort of like a novel. He writes it as more of a true crime. He's like a true crime writer. He's like Truman Capote, although Truman Capote's In Cold Blood has some question about the truth of it, but that's neither here nor there. Actually, there's times where John Watson's narrative is called into question by Sherlock Holmes. Not particularly in this story, but in other ones where Sherlock Holmes will say that you've over-exaggerated what happened. And so there is some question as to the honesty of John Watson. But whatever, any Sherlock Holmes story you read is basically from John Watson's point of view. And so what happens in this one is Sherlock is busy with another case, so he sends John Watson up. John Watson's kind of a tough dude. Like, he's always got a gun. He'll fight. He'll go after criminals if he has to. So John Watson isn't just some pushover. So he goes up to say, okay, John, you've been with me for a few years. You sort of know how my brain works. I mean, you can't imagine, you can't quite reach the levels of my intelligence, but you know my method. So go up there, just look at everything and report back to me constantly, and keep this Baskervilles safe, because he thinks he's in danger, and there's some things to point that he is in danger. For example, while in London, the third creepy thing to happen is he gets a letter from someone, and everything's sort of cut out from newspaper like a ransom letter, except for the word more, which they couldn't find in magazines. I mean, they could have just cut out MOOR in different letters, but whatever. I guess that technology for ransom letters hadn't been figured out yet, so the person had to cut out whole words and then write the word more. And right before you get up to Devonshire, and this is actually one of the things I really like about the book, is there's a list of possible suspects. And the list is so long, and it sort of includes everyone who you're going to run into in Devonshire, that it makes you sort of suspicious of everyone. When you get up to Devonshire, when the story, and I say it like that, when you get up to Devonshire, because this novel is very engrossing, and it has such a strong atmosphere. It builds such a strong atmosphere that you really can put yourself in John Watson's shoes and get into that world that is Devonshire and the moor and all the creepy muck and mire areas and the forest. It just describes things so well and builds such a good atmosphere. I shouldn't even say good atmosphere. It builds such a depressing, dour atmosphere that you really feel it. It's like if you've had like a week straight of rainy days, and you start to feel that, and you really do feel it in this novel. That is the best part of it, is the atmosphere is built up so well, and not just the environmental atmosphere, but the relationships between each person. You really do, you begin to suspect everyone in the novel. You double read everything, in that you read what someone said or what someone does, and you go, why would they do that? That's interesting. Maybe they're the person. And for a while, you don't know until you actually run into Sherlock Holmes, and I guess this will be the only spoiler thing, although I think once you run into his shadow, basically there's a criminal that is hidden out in the woods, and at one point, John Watson and Baskerville figure out that the criminal's been like lurking around, so they decide to go after him. They chase him down, and they run into this like creepy guy just sort of standing in the woods, and then he disappears real quick. And the way they describe the shadow, you have a feeling it's Sherlock Holmes, and then once it becomes apparent it's Sherlock Holmes, the mystery of who's done it has been solved. But then there's a nice little action piece because they have to catch him in the act because there's no real supporting evidence. So that last quarter of the story is good for a different reason, in that the atmosphere the clouds sort of break when Sherlock arrives, and it becomes more of an action adventure story. Still with a lot of atmosphere in it, but the story has the protagonist, I should say, which tends to be John Watson, especially in this story. John Watson's the protagonist. John Watson takes more control of his life, which tends to happen in stories like this, where most of the story is things happening to John and Baskerville, and John just noticing it and writing it down. Now, he takes some action and does some investigating, but for the most part, he's absorbing information and passing it along, which is nice because you can put yourself in the world and sort of look through the eyes and go, what does that person mean? And what's going on here? And why is everything so cloudy and wet and dismal? But then when Sherlock comes, it becomes much more, okay, we need to do this and we need to do that. And this is how we're going to catch the guy. I hope it works. And the plan is one of those plans where it might work, it might not work. And so it builds a really good atmosphere, and then it becomes a fun story. I can't recommend this book enough. I had an easy time talking about it. Clearly, I just burned through 15 minutes of recording. I'm going to have to do editing and see how much I edit it down. I don't think much, though, because it's just such a good, concise, perfect story. The last thing I wanted to talk about real quick is Arthur Conan Doyle does something interesting in which he writes the story in a few different ways, in that he writes it as a narrative that John's writing. Then he includes letters that John is sending to Sherlock. And then he includes a diary entry from John Watson. And it's interesting because the writing doesn't change so much compared to the letter, compared to the manuscript. It is slightly different. And it's amazing because it feels like it's written by the same person, just slightly different, which is, I just like little writing techniques like that. It spices up the story. So I'm going to say I love this book. If you've listened and I haven't sold you on Sherlock Holmes yet, or you think you're just not that into Sherlock Holmes, totally get it. Sherlock Holmes is not in this story a lot. He's probably in half of it, I would say, maybe a little less, the first quarter and the last quarter, and then that middle half is just sort of an adventure of John Watson trying to solve this case himself, and you're right along for that ride. So, absolutely, even if you're not a big Sherlock Holmes fan, pick up The Hound of Baskerville. It's a great story. It's a great novel. It's totally worth a read. Depending on what you're into, it fits into all sorts of different categories. So I would say it's not a very long novel, so it's worth a glance at least, and see if you like the beginning, and then if you like the middle, keep reading, and you'll like the end at that point. All right, well, that's all I have to say about The Hound of Baskerville. I keep wanting to say The Hounds of Baskerville, but it's The Hound of Baskerville. So thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment wherever you get your podcasts. I think the next show is probably going to be a few more short stories, and then there's one more Arthur Conan Doyle novel. There are other novels written about Sherlock Holmes that are not by him. I don't think I'm going to be doing them in this series, maybe later. I have read The House of Silk by Anthony Horowitz, who is a terrific writer, and The House of Silk is totally a wonderful read, and I would also recommend checking that out. All right, well, I hope you have a great day, night, evening.